just to sort of give you a quick outline, I wanted to do three things, and hopefully we'll have time to do a whole bunch of other things. But the first is to give you an overview of the story and talk a little bit about the process of reporting it, and attempt to explain why I chose to do this story as opposed to any number of other stories. Second, I want to talk about Association de Malfaiteurs, which is the counter-terror law that's sort of at the core of this story, and also French counter-terror in general. And then, and this is sort of the complicated part, I want to talk about what we know, and I put that in quotation marks, about Salafi jihadism, about Al-Qaeda, and even about the Islamic State. As a journalist, it's been fascinating and frequently quite troubling to me, for me to look back with the benefit of hindsight, and also a lot of specialized knowledge that I gained in the process of reporting this piece, on what's been written and said about the cases that I looked at, because there's a lot of what is ultimately misinformation out there, and I don't think it intends to be misinformation, but journalism is the first draft of history, and it's a pretty rough draft, it turns out. The story basically focuses on this man named Jamel Beghal. He's an Algerian. He was French until he had his nationality stripped, actually, during his first prison term. He was accused initially in 2001 of a plot to bomb the American embassy in Paris. So I learned about Beghal in the wake of the Charlie Hebdo attacks. He's linked to some of the Charlie Hebdo killers. And I was struck that despite being an American and despite having lived and worked as a journalist in France for several years already, I had never heard of Jamel Beghal, and I'd never heard of a plot to bomb the American embassy in Paris. So I looked into it, and basically in looking into it, I realized that there was sort of more to say than what was being said in the French and international press about this guy, which is to say that he appeared to have been mistreated by the counter-terror apparatus, and the particulars of how he was mistreated struck me as quite relevant and something to be examined, especially in the context of France's very particular counter-terror system. The other question, the other reason for wanting to do a story of this sort, which attempts to look fairly closely at one guy, or two guys to be fair, but looking at them as sort of human beings, is that there's still been relatively little done, it seems to me, in an effort to humanize jihadists, which is to say to understand them as human beings, with human beings involved in human systems, flawed human systems, with all of their own failings and their bizarre preoccupations. It turns out jihadists are a pretty diverse group with a lot of different ideas and a lot of sort of bizarre tendencies that have consequences in the way that they get along together and the way that they move through the world in general. In any case, Beghal. So Jamel Beghal, who's now about 50, is a highly charismatic Franco-Algerian guy. He's no longer French, but he became French, if I'm remembering correctly, in the late 1990s, and then was stripped of his nationality after being charged with terror. This is obviously reminiscent of the debate that's going on right now. It's known to some people that in fact France has been stripping binationals of their French nationality for some time already. There aren't so many cases, and there's some problems with doing it, as we'll see. So Beghal comes to France in the late 1980s. It appears that he's already fairly, you could call him a fundamentalist already. He gets involved with a lot of people who think sort of the same way, ends up going to London, or outside London, but becoming involved with what was at the time called by some people Londonistan. This is when Abu Hamza al-Masri, and in particular Abu Qatada al-Filistini, were operating out of the Finsbury Park Mosque and the Four Feathers Community Center, preaching jihad, or at least preaching ideologies that were quite violent. The thinking being among the British authorities that it was better to have these people close, where they could be monitored, than dispersed throughout the world. Beghal gets mixed into all of this and decides to go to Afghanistan. He goes to Afghanistan in 2000 or so. Late 2000, November 2000 actually. In Afghanistan, he's a fairly big deal. He's sort of a mid-level Islamist leader. He's the co-chief of a particular faction. And he meets with all of the big names. He meets with Zawahiri, who's the head of Al-Qaeda now, although he wasn't at the time. Meets with Zarqawi, obviously before his death. Zarqawi, who became the head of what was known as Al-Qaeda in Iraq, which is sort of the predecessor to ISIS. He thought a lot of Zarqawi, who had a very nice chanting voice, actually, apparently. Also met with Abu Zubaydah, who has famously been waterboarded many, many times, and is sitting in Guantanamo. And it was in particular that meeting with Abu Zubaydah that became a focus in his subsequent trial. Essentially, Abu Zubaydah was thought at the time to be Al-Qaeda. It turns out he wasn't. That had consequences for Beghal and the way that he was charged in France. In any event, Beghal is going to hang out in Afghanistan for a while. He does a little bit of military, paramilitary training. It's not altogether clear to what end, but he decides in the summer of 2001, so before 9/11, that he's going to accompany the wife of his co-chief back to her home in Morocco with her 3 sick children. There's a layover in Abu Dhabi. Beghal is surrounded by what he describes as white ghosts in black sunglasses, and they bring him to a black SUV, blindfolded, and they stick cattle prods in his knees, and thus begin 2 months of what he describes as torture. And it seems pretty credible that what he describes actually happened. It aligns with the sort of torture that's known to go on in the Emirates as opposed to, say, North Africa. It's a little less medieval. He's been written up in reports by fairly reputable human rights organizations like Human Rights Watch, who look quite specifically at these questions. In any event, he comes to France after 9/11 now. He's flown to France, chained to the ceiling of a plane, and is charged in this embassy plot. He had confessed to this embassy plot, it turns out, in the Emirates, under torture. He gets to France and says, "I was tortured." It's not true. There was no embassy plot at all. Anyway, the confession is excluded in trial, but the groundwork has been laid for what we understand of Beghal. And he's convicted in 2005 of association de malfaiteurs, which I'll come to, and released into house arrest. He's released into house arrest, and this is where it gets interesting for the current debate. He's released into house arrest because the French couldn't send him to Algeria. The French basically wanted him to serve his time and then be expelled. Unfortunately, the European Court of Human Rights blocked the expulsion because if they send him to Algeria, it's pretty likely that he'll be tortured, if not worse. And so they're obliged to put him under house arrest, which is a sort of legal limbo. He's sent to the middle of nowhere in central France to a little village called Murat, and it's there that he will come into contact, or it's there that he will meet subsequently with the Charlie Hebdo killers, with Amédi Koulibaly and Cherif Kouachi, whom he had met in prison. He's going to be arrested again in 2010 on very weak charges again, and convicted a subsequent time in 2013, again of association de malfaiteurs. His appeal is rejected in December 2014, and 1 month later, Amédi Koulibaly and Cherif Kouachi, joined by Saïd Kouachi, his older brother, commit the attacks of last January. The story also involves, and I bring this up because we'll meet him in a second, a man named Kamel Daoudi, who was a friend of Beghal's early on, was in Afghanistan with him in 2001, served his time after being convicted in 2005, and was then placed under house arrest, where he remains today. And Daoudi is a sort of different character. He just had a fourth child on December 26th. He's made a life for himself. He says he has renounced jihad. And he's a really particularly thoughtful guy who has the rare capacity for men who have been so deep in extremist ideology, has the rare capacity to take some distance from himself, intellectual distance, and describe what he used to be, and what his former friends still are. Just very quickly, I'll talk about the process of reporting something like this. Reporting on counterterror in France is quite difficult. The French don't really like to talk in general, and the people who are responsible for counterterror are really particularly reticent. So this took quite a long time. I'm embarrassed to say how long, so I'm not going to tell you exactly. But suffice it to say that this was not a few weeks of sort of hanging around and waiting for people to respond. It was more than that. In addition, I started reporting all of this right in the wake of Charlie Hebdo, and there was really a particular reticence to talk, especially because Beghal was initially believed to have perhaps been involved. That has since been debunked as a theory. Beghal is in a prison cell near Rennes, in isolation. He did have a phone, but that phone didn't have a SIM card in it, and didn't actually even have his fingerprints on it, and it hadn't called any of the relevant people. As best anyone can tell, Beghal hadn't been in contact with the Charlie Hebdo killers for at least 2 years by the time the attacks happened. Particularly important to this story were the judges and prosecutors who had been involved in the case. In addition to Beghal's lawyer and Daoudi, the former jihadist, who's now under house arrest. Daoudi himself, as I was saying, was really a critical guide, a voice who could explain his version, obviously, what was actually going on. And what's quite useful about that is that Daoudi, I think, was interested in correcting some of the mistakes, which I'll get to in a little while, but also explaining himself as a former. And again, that's not something that I have seen so much of in any case. We'll hear from him in a little while. Also critical to all of this was getting my hands on a big police report. Sorry, not a police report, a court dossier with thousands and thousands of pages of police reports and transcripts of tapped phone conversations, photographs, surveillance notes. A lot of this was sort of sifting through documents painstakingly. And then the letters. So I was able to get in touch with Beghal through his lawyer, and was able to start a correspondence with him from prison. And he ended up sending me more than 200 pages of handwritten letters, answering questions that I had asked, evading other questions that I had asked, posturing as a victim most of the time, but also being quite lyrical at moments. Some of it was actually quite beautiful. His French is very, very good, and his handwriting is quite distinct. I don't want to describe exactly how I was able to correspond with him. It's sort of a professional secret, and I hope to continue doing it. But he was able to send me letters without having them read by the prison administration, which I think was quite useful ultimately, because I doubt that they would have let them get out. I wonder too, and this is just sort of an aside, but I do wonder whether he might not be charged for what's called apologie de terrorisme, which you could call promoting terrorism, or which is illegal in France, and he has he has very positive things to say about the September 11th attacks, for example, which are published in the article, and I'll be curious to see what the reaction to that is on an official level. There's of course some question about how trustworthy anything that he told me actually is. Some of it I've been able to identify, to verify by crossing sources. And some of it has aligned with what I already believed to be sort of the truth. Some of it seems to have been outright lies. Much of it appears to have been obfuscation, but there's really no way to know. Ultimately, as far as what ended up in the story, I included only what I came to view as his reasonable claims. Or I presented some of the other claims with caveats or doubts about their truth. Beghal's a complicated guy. He reads the Quran, and he also reads Pablo Neruda. He's a big soccer fan, and at the same time he's an acolyte of Abu Musab al-Makdisi, who used to be sort of one of the most reputed jihadist and violent jihadist theorists. He's really a mix of things, and to get at that, I wanted to read just quickly from a passage. He had the immodest habit of lecturing his family and friends about Islamic piety, often because they had come to him seeking his views, but not always. He once chastised his grown sister, Sakina, a Muslim but not a fundamentalist, for wishing him a happy birthday. The birthday is a right of the infidels, he told her. I've said it 1,000 times before, but you persist in offending Allah and pleasing and resembling the enemies of Allah with neither fear nor shame, even though this is very grave. Pardon my ignorance, she replied, testy. Allah will judge himself whether I'm an infidel, and not you. So a little later. In a phone call recorded by investigators in April 2010, Kouachi, this is Sharif Kouachi, one of the Charlie Hebdo killers, who was in Murat at the time, which is the place where Beghal was under house arrest, excitedly told Koulibaly, who was the kosher grocery killer, that he and Beghal had been doing little more than running and sleeping. "Oh, that's great. You all are cool down there," said Koulibaly. "Yeah, we're cool down here. All that's missing is you, but you don't want to come," teased Kouachi. "Oh yeah, brother, so right now we're not cool, we're cool. If you was here, there'd be the L in cool." Koulibaly laughed. Beghal had been doing imitations of him, Kouachi said, and this had kept them, quote, dying the whole day. Over the course of his year of semi-liberty, Beghal's family had come several times to visit him in Murat. So this is after the first case and before the second case. He took dozens and dozens of photographs and videos, all of which investigators discovered upon his arrest. On a yellow summer evening, he and his wife and daughter and 2 sons hiked the parched hills around the village, pausing to rest, squinting into the warm, heavy light, casting long shadows. They ate breakfast in their pajamas, in a tent at a campsite at the edge of town. His daughter, 10 years old in a tattersall summer dress and bandana, romped in a stream. In the winter, bundled in a hooded parka, she made a snow angel. Later, she held icicles under her lip like fangs and bared her teeth in a comic grimace. Her father did the same, and they held their heads together for a selfie in the cold. In addition, in drawers and boxes throughout Beghal's apartment, investigators found 10 mobile phones and numerous SIM cards, at least one of which had been registered under a false name. Press clippings and printouts piled on the desk, in Arabic and French, spoke of kamikaze operations and a spectacular escape involving a helicopter from a prison in the south of France. A laptop computer and 4 external hard disks held thousands of similar documents and Islamic texts, in addition to images of assault rifles and the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center in flames. Beghal's a mix of different things. Let's talk about association de malfaiteurs. This section, unfortunately, or maybe fortunately, because it'll go a little quicker, is going to involve a lot of my reading. And again, this is because this is sort of the easiest way for me to say exactly what I mean to. Association de malfaiteurs terroristes, which is sort of a euphemistic way of describing the law, is the law that is used in almost every terror case in France. There are tons of them going on right now. The guys who come back from Syria right now are charged with it. The guys who were in Afghanistan before are charged with it. The guys who were in Iraq were charged with it. It's sort of it's useful for lots of different things and lots of different reasons. So let me describe it to you. Where the Americans have, by circumstance but also choice, handled Islamist terror suspects primarily as enemy combatants to be kidnapped or killed, France has generally treated them as criminals to be tried. It is the power of Association de malfaiteurs terroristes that has, in large part, permitted this judicial approach. The law was designed as a, quote, force multiplier in prevention, allowing officials to detect dangerous behavior ahead of time and neutralize people judicially, said Jean-Louis Bruguière, who until several years ago was the top counter-terror magistrate in France, and quite a personality, who's often credited as the architect of law. The approach, he boasted, was, quote, very new, very pioneering, and without precedent in the history of the world. Since passage in 1996, Association de malfaiteurs terroristes has permitted thousands of arrests and hundreds of convictions. French authorities contend that it has allowed them to prevent dozens and dozens of terror killings in France. The law criminalizes, quote, the fact of participating in a grouping formed or an agreement established with a view to the preparation of one of any number of, quote, acts of terrorism. Critically, the text makes no mention of any standard for demonstrating the existence of the grouping. Regular contact between suspects tends to be enough, and there is no requirement that these suspects have ties to any known or officially recognized terror organization. Defense attorneys routinely complain that their clients have been charged with an address book crime. Quite literally, guilt is established by association. So, to return to Beghal and the embassy plot, very quickly, he had confessed. He confessed in the Emirates under what he alleges to have been torture. Bruguière, the magistrate, had gone to Abu Dhabi to oversee his questioning, but in fact never saw him. All of the questioning was done through translators, who sort of ferried Bruguière's questions into a different room. And then at the end of this day-long session, emerged with a piece of paper with Beghal's name on it, describing a confession. Whether Beghal actually confessed of his own will or not is impossible to know because it happened in a black box. In any event, Beghal again arrives in France, where he immediately denies this. Bruguière is supposed to have been livid and sort of flew into a rage. But in any case, because that confession was not in fact included in the case, it was excluded by court order, Beghal was not charged with the embassy plot, even though that's why he was arrested, and that was sort of the theory about what he was up to. He's in fact charged with something quite different, and I want to read just the language of what he was actually charged with in 2005. So with the confession excluded at trial in 2005, Beghal was convicted not for the embassy plot, but rather, according to the language of the ruling, for belonging to a, quote, vast network, end quote, of men who had taken up, quote, ideas and theses advocating jihad and violence, quote, and had received arms training in Afghanistan. Quite obviously, the court found, he and his accomplices were, quote, ineluctably fated to enter, at a given time, into violent action. Which is to say, he hadn't actually done anything yet. But that doesn't matter under French law. Okay. It would be far easier to muster sympathy for the man, here we're talking about Beghal, less discomfiting, if he did not hold his particular beliefs, if he did not have the temerity to speak some of them aloud, or if he did not seem to take such delight in cultivating mystery about the others. And yet, what could he possibly say now, or refrain from saying, to convince the world he is deserving of its sympathy? How could he be trusted to do no harm with the rights of a free man? I was going to go into Daoudi, but we're not going to do that. Perhaps, of course, he in fact remains a jihadi, and he has calculated that small admissions will help to obscure the truth of his intent. One cannot know. Yet open societies tend to accept this sort of uncertainty as the inevitable consequence of their openness. Such societies are premised, necessarily, on a certain faith in the good intentions of their citizens. They allow their citizens the freedom to commit what crimes they will, more or less. Perhaps they watch them closely, perhaps they attempt to sway their opinions or engage them in debate, but any punishment generally comes after the fact of a crime, not before. No one can be trusted, and yet, to some degree, everyone must be. Beghal's release is scheduled for 2020. Presumably, he will be placed once again under house arrest, somewhere in France. Perhaps he will plot his revenge. He will have little else to do. Or perhaps he will not. This will be a matter of faith. I hope that's a sort of useful summation of what I think are some of the forces at play and some of the moral questions about these laws. Very quickly, I want to talk about the implications, or what I think are some of the implications of this story for what we know. Part of the appeal of dealing with the cases that I looked at was that they are, for all intents and purposes, or most intents and purposes anyway, cold, which is to say they're closed. People are, have now been sentenced. They're done and over with. It's easier to get more information on them now, essentially, and there's some more willingness on the part of the relevant actors to speak. As a starting point for doing the story, I read a lot of what was out there about Beghal. And after getting deeper into the story and speaking to a variety of sources, I went back to the original press. And I have to say I've been troubled by some of what I've seen. I do sincerely doubt that any of the journalists whose work I'm about to cite, some of whom I know personally and respect, even respect tremendously, had any intention to mislead anyone. Rather, they were dealing with information they had, the limited information that they had, as it was provided to them in the context of a deadline. And God knows I'm sympathetic to those. But I do believe it's probably important that we go back and re-examine maybe a lot of the stories that we think of as being definite, because I don't think they necessarily are, if the case of Beghal is any indication. So let's take, for instance, the fact that today ties to Beghal are cited as reasons for the continued detention of several prisoners at Guantanamo Bay. In at least one of the prisoner assessments that WikiLeaks leaked, which are tremendously useful for anybody working on this kind of stuff, Beghal is in fact presented as having been convicted for, quote, attempting to bomb the U.S. Embassy in Paris, France. So that's the American government essentially misunderstanding what it was that Beghal was convicted of and using it as evidence to detain someone at Guantanamo Bay. I'm troubled by that, simply as someone who's interested in rule of law. But there's a bunch of these. Let me sort of go back through, and I don't know if this is just sort of my own fascination as a journalist, but I have a few little quick quotes. So Beghal's name comes up pretty quickly after 9/11. And I'm not gonna tell you who I'm citing or where I'm citing it, except to say that I'm citing the most respected and probably best American newspapers and French newspapers. And you'll be able to tell which ones are English because I'm going to do it in English, and the ones in French I'm going to do in French. The first is from October 28th, 2001, so a little more than a month after 9/11. Describing the selection of a suicide bomber who was named and identified as a former soccer player who had fallen into drug use and petty crime. And it says, the target, the American embassy in Paris, had been scouted. And then goes on to say that Beghal, who had been stopped, offered details of what could have been one of the deadliest terrorist attacks in France in more than a decade. Law enforcement officials across Europe said the embassy plot gave them a glimpse of how Mr. bin Laden has operated in their midst and offered clues about September 11th, as well as how future plots might unfold. All of this from a man who ultimately, in fact, never belonged to Al-Qaeda, had nothing to do with Al-Qaeda, believed in probably that's unfair. He did not have nothing to do with Al-Qaeda. He lived in the same country as Al-Qaeda, and he hung out with guys who were in Al-Qaeda. He claims that his own interests were somewhat different, were in fact more about building an Islamic emirate in Afghanistan than about conducting external operations against anyone. So let's see. There's another good one. Late last July in Afghanistan, this is from December 28th, 2001. Late last July in Afghanistan, after months of terrorist training, Jamel Beghal, an Algerian-born Frenchman, was summoned to the home of a senior aide to Osama bin Laden. The time for action had come, said the aide, Abu Zubaydah. Mr. Beghal was instructed to return to France via Morocco and Spain and orchestrate a suicide bombing of the American embassy in Paris. Beghal confessed it was a real intelligence break, later recounted in detail by senior French intelligence officials, but it would prove too late to stop the World Trade Center plot. Enough time and work could have led investigators from Mr. Beghal to an address in Hamburg where Mohammed Atta and his cohorts had developed and planned the September 11th attacks, but the hijackers had already slipped into the United States and were within days of carrying out their mission. This is suggesting that Jamel Beghal was in fact directly linked to the September 11th attacks, which, with the benefit of hindsight, is completely nuts. There's just absolutely no evidence whatsoever to suggest that. The journalists who wrote these stories, once again, were at the mercy of circumstance. The sources are counter-terror officials who have a story they want to sell. They're on deadline. And it's important to have the exclusive as well. And these are, very, very nice details. I should say I have undoubtedly been the victim of exactly this sort of circumstance, where there's simply a lack of information. You need to get something out quick, and whatever sounds exciting and right. I mean, this doesn't, in the context, I can certainly imagine this sounded exactly right. Only with several years of investigation would quite the opposite be tried. But let's look at the way that Beghal has continued to be presented. This is a story from 2005 when he was convicted. He's described as a 39-year-old Algerian-born French citizen who was suspected of being one of Osama bin Laden's most important operatives in Europe. There's absolutely no evidence that was presented at trial for that. But that is the way that the judges described it. And the way that the press described it quite broadly. A little bit later, after sentencing, a French court sentenced 6 Algerian French men to prison terms of up to 10 years on Tuesday for their role in a 2001 plot to attack the United States Embassy in Paris, closing the books on one of France's most serious terrorist cases. The plot, in which a suicide bomber was to have driven an explosives-packed minivan into the downtown embassy, was uncovered in July 2001. Again, there's absolutely no evidence that was presented for that at trial. And the reason that this is being reported is because that is exactly what the judges and prosecutors have presented to the world. I could go on. Even this year reporting about the Charlie Hebdo attacks. Beghal was called, quote, Al-Qaeda's top operative in France, who had been dispatched to Paris to set up a cell aimed at attacking United States interests here, French counterterrorism officials said. Again, there has never been any evidence presented before a court of law, at the very least, to suggest that. I can even skip the French because I would really like to have you ask some questions. But very quickly, this is all hardly surprising when some officials are so willing to knowingly distort the truth, or to grandstand as if they knew more than they in fact do. Bruguière, the judge who's sort of credited as the architect of the association law, is notorious for doing this. And in fact, in a 2009 book, a book of interviews that he did with a prominent French journalist, he described Beghal. So this is 2009. This is not only after the investigation, but also after his conviction for association de malfaiteurs, not for the embassy plot. But in this 2009 book, Bruguière declared that Beghal was, quote, tasked by bin Laden's general staff with preparing an attack against the embassy of the United States in Paris. That may be what Beghal still believes, but he made no attempt to clarify that this was never demonstrated before a court of law. To make matters even more interesting, there's a former head of the DGSE, which is France's CIA equivalent, more or less, who was the head of security intelligence for the DGSE in 2001 at the time of Beghal's arrest. He put out a book in 2011 that cast a lot of doubt on the existence of an embassy plot. He claims that in fact Beghal had been used by Al-Qaeda and Khalid Sheikh Mohammed in particular in order to direct attention away from what was coming, which is to say the 9/11 plot. He also said that Beghal had absolutely no capacity to carry out any of the attacks that were suggested in France. In addition, and this is sort of where we get a little more interesting, he suggests that part of what was motivating Khalid Sheikh Mohammed to essentially give Beghal to the authorities by speaking on a tapped phone that he knew to be tapped, is that he didn't like Beghal because they had a disagreement about Beghal's wife. I'm not sure what sort of disagreement it was, but I think that gets at some of what we have yet come to understand about who these men tend to be, which is to say they're just guys. They have wives. Some of them love their wives. Some of them don't love their wives. Some of them wives are nice women. Some of them aren't. They have personalities. And jihad, it turns out, is a very human enterprise, and thus a very diverse enterprise. There are tons of divergences of points of view. It's useful to understand, for example, that in Afghanistan in 2001, which is to say just before 9/11, there were maybe 4,000 or 5,000 jihadis hanging around, foreign jihadis. There was the Taliban, and then there were the Arab Afghans who had come to do international jihad. Only a few hundred of those guys were actually members of Al-Qaeda. The others were members of tons of different groups. And so to sort of lump them all together as having been under the control of Osama bin Laden is to fundamentally misunderstand what these guys are about. Beghal will tell you, I think Osama bin Laden is an extraordinary human being, but he'll also tell you I disagreed with him. He thought spectacular attacks against the West were a waste of time and energy. It wasn't the time and it wasn't the right tactic. Without understanding that, I think we're not heading quite in the right direction to really counter these guys today. And I guess with that, I'm sorry for having sort of run so long and been quite vague. But I'd be happy to answer any questions about any of this or any sort of ancillary questions you might have.
In your piece, you mentioned that the imams in prison are totally out of touch, often retired guys, and that there was a program sponsored by the French government to train new imams, which was subsequently scrapped. Can you speak about the training of imams in France and across Europe?
Yeah, I mean the first part. The first part from everything that I have seen is absolutely true, which is to say there are exceedingly few imams for the prison population that's out there. The French prison population is about 66,000. It fluctuates depending on the season, but the thinking is that about 60% of that population is Muslim. There are 189 registered Islamic chaplains. And just by comparison, there's more than 700 Catholic chaplains for a far, far smaller population. It's a problem. There's no question. And most of these guys are, first of all, it's basically a volunteer gig. And most of these guys are, because it's a volunteer gig, retirees who are doing this simply out of the goodness of their heart, but don't have much connection with these guys. As for the situation across Europe, I suppose it could certainly be true, though frankly, a much more a phenomenon with which I am specifically familiar is the fact that foreign countries send imams here. This is absolutely the case in France, where Morocco, Algeria, Turkey, and Saudi all have, first of all, their own imams who are in France, filling a need, but also interest in promoting their own interests via those imams. also something to take into consideration for the French government.
You said in the piece that more than 60% of French inmates are Arabic or from North African descent. You also said that the French prison administration's solution to jihadists in jail is to spread them across the prison population.
This law was passed in 1996, and all of a sudden, there's all of these jihadists who end up in prison. It's really the first time that this has happened in France, and unfortunately, the prison administration wasn't really prepared to deal with them. And so, on the fly, their solution was to spread them around. Because they thought if you put them together, they're going to plot together. 20 years down the road, the recognition is that that didn't really work out so well. And so now they're reverting to the solution they feared, which is to say to group them together. There are some pilot programs just getting started now to put them in what are being called quarantine zones, so that they can't infect the rest of the population. Neither solution is great, and I certainly don't pretend to have the answer, but I think that there's absolutely no question that spreading them around was not a fail-safe solution.
Can you explain why it is self-evidently wrong to strip dual citizens of their French citizenship when they're charged with a crime?
There's at least two good reasons, one of them practical and one of them moral and ethical, in my view anyway. The practical reason is you can strip these guys of their citizenship without contravening international law, which means they have to have some citizenship. You can't make non-citizens. The problem is you do it, and then you're stuck with them. Because you can't send them to Algeria.
Why not?
Because France is a party to the European Court of Human Rights, which says if you send him to Algeria, he's going to be tortured or killed. Why
should they be tortured or killed?
Algeria is a really particularly reputed anyway. It's a really particularly brutal intelligence service that in particular in the wake of the Civil War in the 1990s is nasty with Islamists. And so you can't send these guys back to Algeria, practically speaking. You can try. And Beghal, in fact, says that, and I've never been able to verify this, but he says that he was literally on the tarmac at Roissy, being led to the plane when his lawyer came running with a piece of paper that showed that the European Court had blocked his expulsion. But the problem is you end up with these guys on your hands. So what do you do with them? Well, you put them under house arrest. That costs a lot of money and requires surveillance because obviously you've judged them too dangerous to have on your soil. But you've got them on your soil and you're paying for them. It's not a solution. The second issue, I think, is that it's a determination that this sort of terrorism, specifically this sort of terrorism, not other sorts of terrorism, this sort of terrorism is somehow so evil that we need to treat it differently. Why not strip binationals who are serial murderers of their second nationality, of their French nationality? I suppose an argument could be made, but I personally find it troubling that we expend so much intellectual energy looking at Islamist terror in particular, when, despite the horrors that it produces, it still represents, an infinitely small proportion of death, and even a violent death. Given the French context, where Muslims already feel stigmatized, and where ideologies that differ from the state line, especially when it comes to decrying Western imperialism and foreign policy in general, is not so popular and maybe brings stigmatization. I personally think it's quite dangerous as far as the effects that it might have on those people. But I'll give it some more thought.
Can you speak about the craft and how you put this story together?
It was a friggin' slog. It was quite complicated. The story ends up being structured, and I'm sorry for those of you who aren't familiar with it. The story ends up sort of being structured bookended by this guy Daoudi, who was sort of presented as Beghal's accomplice, but has stepped back from his original views and become a sort of fully functioning citizen. And the thought there was to sort of present a foil, a counterexample, and it simply worked best to sort of start and end with him, because otherwise he got mixed into everything. I had initially tried to write this story sort of jumping around in time, which I thought was a better rhetorical device, but it became incredibly complicated, as I presume most of you came to realize as I struggled to explain what was going on, and so we ended up just sort of doing it from start to finish chronologically, with Daoudi at both ends.
I've spent some time in the jungle, the refugee camp in Calais, and currently police are expelling refugees, and they face horrible treatment and conditions. I wonder if the French police will ever be held accountable for that.
No, I don't think so. The difference, though, with Calais, and as sympathetic as I am to the plight of the people who are there, they are there legally, for the vast majority in any case. And as human and sympathetic as I like to think myself, it is illegal. That being said, I wish the French would just say, great, why don't you become French citizens and we'll all be happy, or why don't we just give you to the Brits and then they can deal with you, because that's what you actually want. I don't pretend to have an answer. I mean, there's a reason that Calais and the jungle have existed for however many years it is now, and this will not be the first time that they bulldoze the camp. They've done it more than once before, and they just keep coming back. But as far as the stigmatization that the police do, no, I can't see any possible way that they will be held to account for that.
I wanted to ask you why you wrote this piece, and what you can say about the French system versus the American one.
I basically came to see Beghal as a way to look at, a vehicle to look at some of the problems with the French approach, which is sort of universally hailed as being particularly effective, or at least was until homegrown jihadists started killing people in 2012. There was a stretch of 20 years, there's just no question about it, or 15 anyway, between 1996 and 2012, when there was not a single successful terrorist attack on French soil. Nobody died for 15 years. The French were proud of that and trotted that figure out as a defense of their system. Then the chickens came home to roost, and it turned out that there was sort of a knock-on effect of the system. I thought that looking at Beghal was going to be a way to both get at a little bit of why there was the secondary effect of sort of creating more problems, creating more jihadis by putting people in prison, and I also thought he because of the problems in his cases. This is a guy who was convicted twice. On the basis of, for having looked at it quite closely, very little evidence. These are cases that I'm quite certain, at least with the evidence that was presented in court, never would have held up in an American court. They hold up in French courts because that's the law and that's the tradition. And there are benefits to that, I'm sure. But from an American standpoint, it's quite striking how weak these cases are.
Because of the malfactor.
I think exactly, the two association de malfaiteurs cases. And I'm happy to go into some more depth about the particular weaknesses. But as far as what that means for sort of the comparison of the American and French approach, the French admirably decided that they wanted to deal with these things judicially. And that was a decision made in the 1990s when the country was under attack from the GIA. This gets us way into the weeds, but there was the Algerian Civil War. It was a little bit exported to France because the French were backing the military regime that had sort of cracked down on the Islamists. And there were attacks in France, and people were killed, and it was scary. And so the law was an outgrowth of that. they decided to treat it as a judicial problem, and that's great. But they gave themselves tools that are arguably, not even arguably, I mean, are patently exceptional. They had to step out of the bounds of normal law, create new rules, and then use those rules in courts. So it's the sort of thing that on paper looks great, but the closer you look, the more you see that people were arrested. There were mass arrests of dozens, if not hundreds, in some cases, of people. Many of whom were then let go. There was a famous case in 1998 called the Shalabi trial, where they had literally rounded up 300 people, and it ended up in a disastrous case with a handful of convictions. It was in fact so big that they had to hold it in a prison outside Paris because they didn't have space in the court, and it was absurd, and it created a lot of ill will within the Muslim community towards the French state, and it subjected a lot of people to what was unfair treatment. Obviously, the Americans have approached it quite differently for reasons of practicality, but also because the problem is somewhat different. Homegrown jihad is not so much a thing in the United States. Obviously, with Facebook and the rise of ISIS, things are changing a little bit. But the French have always, or at least since the early 1990s, had a problem with people who are French, or at least have been living for years and years and years on French soil, planning things in France. And so they chose a route that the Americans probably didn't really have the option of doing. If the Americans had wanted, perhaps they would have said, well, sure, we're going to go into Tora Bora and then capture these guys and then fly them to Manhattan to be tried. That seems a little Pollyanna-ish, though obviously the choices that were made, which was to go completely outside the law, and even the laws of war, reprehensible for its own reasons. But I think that the take-home message I think is that yes, the French do it within the law. It looks great from an American standpoint, and it's a little bit of a catastrophe in practice.
There was a woman that you cited in the article speaking about her fear because a number of these prisoners will be getting out soon.
That's absolutely right. One of the in a nod, and I frankly don't understand this, but in a nod to how weak these cases in fact are, the French decided that the maximum sentence, initially anyway, for association de malfaiteurs, the terrorist version of association de malfaiteurs, is going to be 10 years. And so, guys got sentenced to 10 years, or 7 years, or 6 years, and then they get out. And there has been a troublingly small amount of planning for when they get out. Essentially the plan is, okay, well, we tell the intelligence services that they're out. Well, now the intelligence services have to deal with all of the guys in Syria, coming back from Syria, in addition to this whole generation of people who are now getting out of prison. And there's no question whatsoever that they're overwhelmed.
Given the fact that you are continuing to correspond with Beghal, are you considering writing a biography of him?
I don't think so, but maybe. I would like to meet him. I've tried to meet him, and unfortunately the French authorities have not allowed that. I'm exploring whether that's the sort of decision that can be opposed in a court of law. I think Beghal is one of a great number. He's still quite convinced, I think, of his beliefs, though he's obviously read a lot and explored intellectually. I'd have to meet the guy before I make a decision.
Because the ending of your piece, especially the rhetorical statement,
right.
And what strikes me as your very instinctive feeling about, you brought it all together, then perhaps only you will know the answer when you meet him.
I think so. To be quite honest, I spent months and months and months with Beghal in a way, and I don't pretend to have a handle on the guy, which is humbling. and quite frightening. But I think I probably have to say the same about almost any human being, except he has views that are quite extreme, and most people don't.
You mentioned that Beghal managed to get a cell phone into isolation in prison. How does this happen?
I have some knowledge about this, that though I didn't specifically report on it for this piece. I mean, basically, there's a, like in any prison, there's an underground economy, so that's one thing. I mean, you can get stuff into prison. You can get drugs into prison. You can get phones into prison. You can get weapons into prison. Usually, that has to do with guards who are more interested in making a few extra bucks on the side than they are in preventing people from having this sort of thing. The other thing is that it is patently in the interest of the intelligence services for these guys to have cell phones, for terrorists in particular, or terrorist suspects in particular, to have cell phones in prisons. So there's a rule, which has been described explicitly by the prison official who's quoted in the piece. There's an informal rule that says, unless there's some sort of imminent danger to his having a phone, you let him keep it. We know he has it, but we're listening to it. And part of the reaction actually to Charlie Hebdo has been to install more listening devices in French prisons. So from an intelligence standpoint, it's quite useful for them to have phones. But from what I understand, without having ever spent any time as a prisoner in a prison, thank God. My understanding is that it's just not very complicated for these guys to get stuff. They have communications with the outside world. They are allowed to meet face to face with family and friends, people who are on the list, and they get stuff.
You worked at the Times before. Can you talk a little bit about your background?
Yeah, I worked for the Times for several years, and was fortunate enough to do some of some not unrelated stuff. I covered Mohammed Merah in 2012 and Mehdi Nemouche, who was the killer at the Brussels Jewish Museum in 2014, and spent a fair amount of time thinking about this stuff. And also covered some Association de Malfaiteurs cases, as it happens. It's a pretty famous case, I think in 2012, involving a Franco-Algerian physicist who ended up in contact with an Al-Qaeda guy and was basically charged with being a terrorist, even though he was. It does not appear that he was. He didn't have any intent of going anywhere or particularly blowing anything up. It appeared. But so I became familiar with the law and with some of the pushback against the law, the sorts of cases that it could bring, and how those cases were not necessarily the strongest that you might see before a court of law.
Have you seen the Koulibaly documentary about his time in prison? And what can you say about the fight on terrorism?
I've seen parts of the Koulibaly documentary, though I confess I haven't seen the whole thing.
I know, because it was on your television.
Right.
No, it's not much. Something.
But he's obviously a savvy guy. I have looked at a lot of the pictures that he took from prison and elsewhere, which ended up in the court files. As far as how to fight them, I mean, I think unfortunately, there's no good answer except the cop out, which is to say this is a very long fight, and I think unfortunately it's maybe problematic to see it as a fight. There's a lot of talk these days about how to keep people from going to Syria, and I think if the state could do a better job of making people like being here, of making Muslims and Arab Muslims in particular, but Muslims of all stripes, feel as though they were full members of French society, with rights to their own particularities, rights to their own differences, rights to their own histories, but not less French for them. It is my own belief, anyway, that at least some of this problem would be solved. Certainly not all of it. But these are problems that are cultural, ideological, military. There's so many facets. It obviously defies an easy solution.
Thank you very
Very much.